Hello and welcome into another episode of Locked On Wolves. Today on the show, we're answering one very simple question. Who is most likely to get cut from the Timberwolves roster? Following last week's trade, the roster is now beyond full. Someone's going to have to go. We'll talk about all that on the show today, plus previews of the camp contract players and two-way contract players on the Wolves roster. It's all upcoming. Welcome in. You are Locked On Wolves.
You are Locked On Timberwolves, your daily Minnesota Timberwolves podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello and welcome to the Locked On Wolves podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. My name is Ben Beecken. I'm the host of Locked On Wolves. Today's episode is brought to us by our friends at Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use the code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off your first purchase. Happy Tuesday, everybody. We are only 3 days away from another preseason game for the Wolves, and then they come fast and furious after that. There's one Friday, there's one Sunday. So we are in the thick of training camp, what's really training camp now, plus the preseason, but still in the wake of last week's massive trade. And the Wolves roster is now full. I want to talk about who on a guaranteed contract is going to leave, is going to be cut before the end of training camp, and overall the state of the roster, contract situations, but also some previews today on two-way contract players and the camp guys, right? Like there's a couple guys on non-guaranteed camp contracts, less than there were a couple weeks ago, less than there were going to be before this trade. So we'll kind of level set all that here on this Tuesday. A big thank you for making Locked On Wolves your first listen every single day. Of course, this show is free and available everywhere. No matter where you listen to podcasts, you can find Locked On Wolves. You can also watch on YouTube, as well as on the Locked On Sports Minnesota app on both Roku and Amazon Fire TV. All right. So the Timberwolves roster right now, as it stands, a reminder, every team can have up to 21 players in camp. The Timberwolves had 21. They had Chase and Randle, who ended up getting waived. There was Jaylen Clark got waived as well. So both of those players, I think Randle was going to get waived anyway. They basically just now have the ability to bring him back with the G League team. But in the wake of last week's Julius Randle, Donte DiVincenzo, and Bates-Diop acquisitions, the Timberwolves also waived Jaylen Clark, who was last year's power forward best power forward in the country, won the Karl Malone Award for San Diego State, started his college career at Ohio State. We talked about him a few weeks ago, but he's no longer in training camp with the Wolves because of this trade. So now with 21, what changed here though is he went out, and obviously Karl-Anthony Towns went out, and the Timberwolves brought in 3 players. And of course, the players the Wolves brought in are all on guaranteed contracts, which now means the Wolves have 16 contracts that at least have some level of a guarantee to them. So the 15 guarantees, which I'm not going to necessarily rattle off all the names, but it's the rotation guys, it's some of the fringe rotation guys, it's all the draft picks from the last couple of years that, obviously includes Josh Minott. Remember, Luka Garza's on a standard contract now. So all the way through 14 guys. The new acquisition being Bates-Diop, he's on a fully guaranteed contract for this year. It is only $2.6 million. He signed a 2-year deal at basically the minimum last year with Phoenix, ended up getting traded from Phoenix to Brooklyn to the Knicks this offseason, and then the Timberwolves, of course, just acquired him. Fully guaranteed contract. And the only player on the roster that doesn't have a fully guaranteed contract that has some level of guarantee is PJ Dozier. PJ Dozier, of course, a Tim Connelly favorite, got his start in Denver with Tim Connelly, had some nice games there, had I think it was an ACL injury that knocked him out for a while, ended up going to play overseas and bounced around a little bit last year as well. Here stateside, was briefly with the Kings. And he's back. Like he got signed this offseason. There was a lot of, I would say, unnecessary angst about this on Twitter or around the Wolves blogosphere as well, because it is a partially guaranteed contract, essentially hey, you may not make this team, but at least there's a guarantee here. So it's going to make it harder for us to cut you, right? Like if the Wolves hadn't made this 3-for-2 trade, or I guess 1-for-3 trade going the other way, then Dozier would have made this team as like the 15th guy, essentially. Now I think he's going to get cut. PJ Dozier only has $1 million guaranteed on his contract. The rest of it becomes guaranteed in January. I'm going to pull the exact date here, but I believe it's like January January 6th-ish is when it should be, when it becomes fully guaranteed. I lost it, but I'm going to find it. So that is that to me tips the Wolves' hands on what they're going to have to do, because it's either that or you're eating. Ownership's not going to have an appetite to eat an extra $1.5 million, right? Because if you waive one of these other guys, you still have to pay them unless somebody else picks them up and assumes their contract. You're just out the minimum at that point. I guess given that, like, Bates-Diop is likely going to get signed if you cut him, but he's also a better player than PJ Dozier. So I don't know why you wouldn't just waive PJ Dozier. So that would be, and actually, you know what? On Spot Track, it doesn't have that date when his contract becomes fully guaranteed, but I'm pretty confident it's first week in January, unless it does have this as fully guaranteed, unless that's changed. But it hasn't been reported, so I believe it's still just a partial guarantee. So I would expect PJ Dozier to be waived at the end of camp. Again, you can have 21 guys in camp, so it's not coming soon. I know, like, Denver just waived some guys this weekend, I think. It doesn't feel like that's necessary, because you could have up to 21. Why wouldn't you have the bodies for, reps in training camp? And why wouldn't you have the bodies for reps in preseason games for some of that depth? Because inevitably there's going to be a couple of these games where Mike Conley, Rudy Gobert, like, these guys aren't all going to play in every preseason game. We already saw Anthony Randle sit out the first one. So I don't think it's coming soon. And also, like, God forbid somebody has a longer term injury that crops up, you'd still want to have the depth of Dozier, the ability to bring him into the regular season if that's ultimately what the front office decides. So I think PJ Dozier is going to be the odd man out. Bates-Diop is a legitimate NBA kind of fringe rotation guy at this point. So I would be really surprised if they just cut him. He played rotation minutes last year for a pretty good Phoenix team. And before that was a starter for some bad Spurs teams. But I think right now in the prime of his career, he's more of a defensive minded, like a big three, can play the small ball four. And we'll do a full preview on him here in a couple of days, but I like the idea of having just that additional depth. That if Bates-Diop, I mentioned him earlier as if he was like the 15th guy. I mean, he's not, right? Like, he's should be higher on the depth chart than that, but he's not going to be part of this rotation. So there could be value in flipping him at the trade deadline, right? If there's a team that, look at some of the, obviously Phoenix's depth is much better, but like the Knicks, somewhat ironically, like, I don't know how they're going to make a trade. In fact, they can't really, because of, they can't take back any additional salary at all. But like a team like that might have a strong top 7, top 8 that really needs to shore up the back end of the rotation sometime near the deadline. Bates-Diop would be a prime candidate to trade at that point in time. So that's a real possibility. But sitting where the roster is now, there's 15 guys with full guarantees. PJ Dozier reportedly has a partial guarantee on his contract of $1 million. And then the rest of it is the 3 two-way players who we're going to talk about today. Of course, Jesse Edwards, Jaylen Clark, and Daishen Nix. And then you also have the camp guys who are both legit NBA players as well. And by legit, I mean, like, they played real NBA minutes last season, in Skylar Mays, who played with Portland and the Lakers, and Eugene Omoruyi, who played with the Wizards last year. So there is legit depth on this team. It has to be, like, not that anybody's counting how legit their team is by the 20th and 21st guys in camp, but those guys played on NBA teams last year and contributed positively. And this is just a really, really strong roster. So I want to get into some previews on those guys, as well as the two-way contract guys. So we're going to do all that here next. Today's episode of Locked On Wolves is brought to us by our friends. Today's episode of Locked On Wolves is brought to us by our friends over at FanDuel. NFL fans, you can start the season with a big return on FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. So when you get a hunch in the middle of a game, you can check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more on the same page where you place your bets. I didn't do great live betting the Chiefs-Saints game on Monday night. I felt really good about a live line. Didn't turn out great. I actually felt pretty good about the over in that game as well. Didn't go great, although I felt like I was pacing okay for it. If the Saints had just scored a touchdown there at the end, we would have been all right. So I didn't do great there. But the live betting thing, when you get a hunch in the middle of the game, it's awesome. And it's a ton of fun. Of course, Thursday night football later on this week. And of course, all the other sports too. If NBA preseason is your thing, if you want to do that on FanDuel, you could do that too. Plus, right now, FanDuel will get you started with $200 in bonus bets guaranteed when you place your first $5 bet. Again, your first $5 bet Get $200 in bonus bets guaranteed from FanDuel. Again, that's FanDuel, FanDuel.com. All right, let's talk about the camp guys. There's only two of them now. We talked about Chase Randle's no longer there. Jaden Ledee's no longer there. So I don't want to spend a ton of time here. I talked about each of these guys when the Wolves did sign them initially, but let's start with Skylar Mays. So Skylar Mays, of course, started last season with the Portland Trailblazers. The year prior, he had been with them and played really well in a short, a short run, essentially, and came back with the team last year, played well beginning early on in the season for them as well when they had they needed him to play a lot, right? Like he played 37 minutes in a close loss at Sacramento in early November last year, had 18 points, 11 assists. He backed that up with a 15 and 12 next time out, and that was a 33-minute performance against the Lakers. And then from that point forward, he actually scored double figures in 5 of 6 games during that stretch when he was starting for them. And then he fell out of the rotation. I think they got healthy at the time, and he played once from basically Thanksgiving to Christmas. He played one time. Eventually, he got waived and then ended up going to the Lakers. That's the old, I feel like this happened. Who was the guy? Was it Sundiata Gaines or somebody that hit like a big shot against the Wolves and then they ended up signing? This is going way. I just went back like 12 years. No, I guess Gaines hit the big shot maybe with the Jazz. I don't know. It doesn't matter. But that sort of thing where where Skylar Mays goes out and drops 15 and 12 on the Lakers, and then the Lakers come back later in the season and sign him. He didn't really play rotation minutes there hardly at all, but was just kind of on the roster then the rest of the year. So, but what Skylar Mays is a pretty big point guard. He's really more of a combo guard. He played point guard for Portland. I see him more as a shooting guard or a big point guard that's really has more of an emphasis on scoring. He's an okay passer. He doesn't have a lot of burst. He doesn't have a ton of athleticism, but the length plays and he knows how to play. He knows how to get his, if he gets a defender on a sloppy closeout, he can get past them and use his length. It's actually a little bit like, in some ways, the guard version of Karl-Anthony Towns is what he reminds me of with how, let me be very clear, with how he can pump fake and get around guys, not because he's fast, has burst, has athleticism, but because he's long. He's got pretty fluid movement. Like he's a fluid scorer, even if he's not super athletic. The touch is just okay so far in the NBA, at least from outside the arc. He's not a huge 3-point shooter, but he's shot 145 threes in 105 games. So not quite a 3.5 a game. And he's 34.5%. Last season with Portland, when he started those 5 games, played in 21 total, he only shot 29%, just under 29%, but it was only 49 3-point attempts. So he's not a big time scorer, but that's the type of player he's going to have to be is he's going to have to be able to score with, guile and craft. And he's not a fantastic passer. He's just a fine passer. He's a pretty, I would say, adequate defender. Again, using the size, using the frame is more important for him defensively than anything else, because I think he's a modest athlete. So he's a depth piece, for preseason. He didn't play in the preseason opener. I'm sure it's, he's running the fourth unit in training camp practices or whatever. That's the type of guy he is. Undoubtedly, he signed an Exhibit 10 contract, which again, as a refresher, means he gets an extra $78K if he sticks with the G League team for 60 days past when he's waived from the Wolves. So that is what I would assume he'd be doing this year for Minnesota is actually playing for Iowa and not Minnesota. I think that's where Skylar Mays ends up. He's played a lot in the G League the last couple of years. Actually, last year he didn't play that much in the G League at all, but a couple of years ago he played pretty heavily there. Kind of similar story where the outside the arc is a little below league average, not super high volume there, although he shot it a bit more in the G League than he did at the NBA level. Good free throw shooter, again, decent touch. It's just there's nothing that really pops when you watch him play. He's just kind of a solid player with good size. And that's what Skylar Mays is. Eugene Omoruyi, we talked about when the Wolves signed him. I'm pretty excited about him for a camp guy. Again, Exhibit 10 contract. Very likely he spends the season with the Iowa Wolves and never, doesn't break camp with Minnesota. I'd love to see him play in preseason. He played 43 games for the Wizards last year, only 9 minutes per game. And then the year prior, he had split time between Oklahoma City and Detroit. So he actually started his career with Dallas as an undrafted guy. And Omoruyi just has really, really kind of tantalizing length, good athleticism. In some ways, the opposite of Skylar Mays. Obviously, different players. I should say Omoruyi's he's a wing, right? Like he's essentially a three. Could probably play some small ball four because I think he's a decent enough rebounder. But that's when I say he's the opposite of Skylar Mays. Is Skylar Mays is just kind of a solid player, nothing remarkable. Omoruyi is the opposite, where like if he could put a few things together, there's actually some real upside there for him to be a rotation guy. I don't see a world in which Skylar Mays is ever more than a fringy type backcourt guy, right? But Omoruyi is there are things he does that pop. Now, he is already 27 years old, even though he's only been in the league for a couple of years. He played at Oregon, or at least he finished. Yeah, he started at Rutgers, played his last season at Oregon. He did some stuff in March Madness for Oregon a few years ago that was really impressive too. Shot the ball well that season, just under 38% from outside the arc for the Ducks. But I think there's a world in which he could be a fringe rotation like defender. Can do a little bit of everything decently well. Isn't a fantastic passer by any means, but last year had a 13% assist rate with Washington. Again, limited minutes, so it ends up being a really small sample. I mean, he's still played under 87 NBA games, under 1,100 minutes, so not heavy time at the NBA level, but can do a little bit of everything with some athleticism, with a little bit of upside at age 27, being a 4-year college guy. I do think that there's something to like there. There are several things to like there, really. In terms of what he's done at the G League level, for whatever it's worth, he did play 4 games. Actually, no, he played 12 games there total between regular season and Showcase Cup last year for Capital City Go-Go, the Wizards G League team. And he played pretty well. Like all the advanced stats look pretty good. I mean, he shot the ball a little bit under what you'd want. He was like 30% from outside the arc on pretty high volume. I mean, he was attempting about 4 threes a game overall in the G League last year. But overall, the scoring was pretty good. He got to the line a little bit. He's a 70+% free throw shooter. And he can rebound his position, which is big. The Wolves they love these long physical defenders, and especially on the wing. And if they can find guys like that who can rebound, that's a bonus for Minnesota. They need as much of that as possible. Ultimately they finished, I talked about this the other day, they finished top 10 in defensive rebound rate last season. The Wolves did as a team, but that's up quite a bit from where it was the year before. And the first year with Rudy Gobert, this team was not a good defensive rebounding team. And a lot of that was on the guards, and it was on the wings, not doing their part. The Wolves do not crash the glass schematically on offense, but it was more defensive rebounding was the issue. And now moving on from D'Angelo Russell certainly helped that situation. And, Conley versus D'Lo and some of the other stuff, like Jaylen Noel was also like a mind-bogglingly bad rebounder for his position. I know it doesn't seem that important from, guards and wings because everybody focuses on the bigs, but Rudy can't do it all himself. Rudy and Cat couldn't do it all themselves. And Naz is I would say a slightly below average defensive rebounder anyway. Like that's always been, he's gotten better the last couple of years, but that's always been one of the drawbacks to Naz, or one of the, not drawbacks, but the things he's needed to work on is if he's going to play the 5, he's got to rebound. Now, if Naz is your 3, you're in pretty good shape rebounding wise. And he did play a little bit of 3 last season. We may still see that this year in lineups with Naz and Julius Randle and Rudy Gobert when Naz plays the 3. That changes that dynamic a little bit. But all that to say, having somebody like Omoruyi who can provide that and give you some additional rebounding from a non-big position is important. And again, he's going to get waived. He's going to spend the season with the Iowa Wolves. But as far as guys who have a chance, like if somebody were to get hurt or if somebody were to just have a miserable training camp and they just decide like, hey, we're going to eat as long as we're eating the $1 million on PJ Dozier, like we're also going to waive. I don't know who else they'd waive. They're not very unlikely to waive Keita Bates-Diop, as I stated in the first segment today, but you never know. I mean, he would kind of probably be next man up, I think, ahead of Skylar Mays, just because he can do more things. And there is a bit of upside there. You could throw him out there end of quarter situation, have him defend, if Josh Minott were to get hurt or something like that. Somebody like Omoruyi would be not a bad direction for the Wolves to go with a final roster spot if they needed to. All right, let's preview the two-way players. Spend a couple minutes on each of those guys. Tell you who they are, what to expect from what to expect from each of them this season. We'll do all that here next to close out the show. Today's episode of Locked On Wolves is brought to us by our title sponsors at Gametime. Gametime has a new feature called Gametime Picks that makes getting tickets for your favorite live events even easier. Gametime Picks filters out the fluff to show you only incredible deals on great seats, so you don't have to waste time searching through thousands of tickets. And you could get anything at any tickets to any live event. I shouldn't say anything. Tickets to any live event at Gametime across the map. So sporting events, obviously. You could also go to comedy shows. You can find theater tickets. You can any sort of live event that you're interested in, you can get over at Gametime. And it's an awesome way to get your tickets. There's a ton of different features that are really attractive. You can see panoramic views from your seat in the app before you buy, which is super important. I'm pretty picky when it comes to a seat, no matter where it is, like including the theater, maybe less for like stand up, but if I'm going to go see like a Broadway type production or a concert, certainly sports, I'm very picky about my seating. Also, Gametime has all-in pricing. You can toggle that feature on to show you the total up front with no surprise fees at checkout. Make sure that you toggle it on to have it populate there, but seeing the total price early on in the process without being surprised with fees at the end is awesome. Take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use the code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account, redeem the code LOCKEDONNBA. That's LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off. Download Gametime today. What time is it? Gametime. All right, let's close out today by talking about the two-way guys. So the Timberwolves have 3 two-way contract signees on their roster. We know all about Daishen Nix. We are going to talk about him. And we know about undrafted rookie Jesse Edwards, and then also second-round pick from last summer, the 2023 draft, Jaylen Clark. So we're going to talk about all 3 of those guys here today. Daishen Nix, we'll start there. This one was surprising to me that they brought him back. They must. I said this before, and I don't want to take away from Daishen. Like there's things he can do. We'll talk about that in a second. But for a player who's, in my opinion, just an inefficient scoring guard, who's a mediocre defender, but he's big body and all that stuff, they must just love Daishen Nix. It's a little bit like the PJ Dozier thing. This has only been going on a year, whereas PJ Dozier has been a Tim Conley guy for several years. But it's just, there must be other stuff, right? This is where the intangibles come in, locker room stuff, bench guy, like leader of the bench mob last year, obviously barely played in the G League on a 2-way contract, but also barely played in the NBA for the Wolves. He only appeared in 15 games last year, and he was basically on the bench, I don't know, probably 3/4, if not more, of the Wolves games. There was only one game last season where Daishen Nix saw rotation minutes. And there were still, and that was the game where there was no Mike Conley, no Jordan McLaughlin. This, I think it was pre-trade deadline. I think Shake Milton was hurt, the whole thing. So they had to play Daishen Nix, and it was a game they won in Utah when they were severely shorthanded. But there were other games where they only had one point guard, and they just were like, yeah, we're good. We don't need to play Daishen. So it was like, using to kill Alexander Walker more and Ant more running the offense. So I thought that was interesting. For a guy that they clearly did not want to play, even when they were very shorthanded in the backcourt, they still brought him back. And there's still some upside there. I mean, he's still only 22 years old. He doesn't turn 23 until basically Valentine's Day. And of course, he didn't play college ball. He took that year in between and didn't go to college. This was COVID year, right? So 2020 would have been his year in college, and then played heavy minutes for the Rockets for a couple of years, but just didn't shoot the ball well. Like in 96 NBA games for his career, he's under 36% from the field, not from the 3-point line. 29% on 3-pointers, 2 per game over his NBA career. And the passing's, he's a good passer, but the turnover rate was actually higher than his assist rate both years in Houston. In the 50 minutes he played in a Wolves uniform last year, that was much better. Like the turnover rate was much lower, but in extended playing time as a 19 and 20-year-old with Houston, that turnover rate was too high. They must really also like whatever upside there could be here for Daishen, and this I think is the last year he could be on a 2-way deal. So I guess why not? And if you like him in the locker room, if they think he could turn into, now remember, like, who knows with Mike Conley, he's got 2 years left on his deal, but if he retires and Dillingham becomes a starter and they like Nix enough and he shows enough this year in practice and in limited playing time, maybe he does play a bit more in the G League. He only played what? Total of, I guess he did get into 13 games last year in the G League for the Wolves, but it was more the same, right? Like the shooting percentages are all around 40% from the field, under league average clearly from outside. It was what, 25% from three on a lot of volume in the G League. So like he's got to show something this year if he's going to stick around. But I'm sure the idea is, could we develop him as a permanent backup point guard down the road? So don't expect him to see any playing time at the NBA level this year, even with the Wolves light in the backcourt. But we'll see how it plays out. We'll see if he gets some opportunities at the G League level as well. Maybe more than those 13 games he played last year. And the Wolves do have a little bit more depth in the backcourt this year that they at least want to give minutes to in Rob Dillingham. Like there's upside to develop there, which wasn't the case with Jordan McLaughlin and ultimately Shake Milton / Monte Morris. So I wonder if there is maybe some opportunity if the Wolves end up shorthanded, Conley gets a rest on a, back-to-backs or 4 games in 6 days or whatever, if there is a little bit more opportunity for Daishen Nix. Let's talk about Jaylen Clark. Jaylen Clark was a second-round pick by the Wolves in June of 2023 and had a real shot at being a first-round pick until he had torn his Achilles playing at UCLA earlier that year in March, I guess. Right, I think it was right before the NCAA tournament. So Jaylen Clark, his calling card is defense. He was probably the best point of attack defender in all of college basketball in the 22-23 college season at UCLA. And there were some, like I think Sam Vecini at The Athletic had him as a lottery pick. Like he was that good defensively, and thought when the Wolves picked him in the second round, it was one of the best picks of the draft. Of course, he did not play at all last season, recovering from the Achilles. He played in Summer League, had a couple of just dominant Summer League performances defensively, and then had a couple that were much shakier. I would put the first preseason game of this year in that same category where he had a couple of moments. He had a couple of really nice steals, just picking the pocket of the guy he was guarding. And then he can look very lost and I don't know, robotics, maybe not the right word, but just lost is also not a bad way to say it, I guess. A little bit lost, a little bit robotic offensively. The jumper's not there. And also, like, to be fair, he's never played pro basketball. I know he was around the team all last year, but he didn't play until the very end of the season. He started practicing with the Iowa Wolves. And so he's going to play in the G League all season long. Don't expect to see Jaylen Clark at the NBA level unless the Wolves are really need bodies. He's going to be playing in the G League a lot to develop whatever he has offensively, make sure that his legs are underneath him defensively, or overall really. But the defense is already NBA ready. As long as his legs are there and he's in game shape and all that stuff, he's plug and play defensively. So that gives him a chance if the Wolves have injuries. Like that's the sort of guy that Chris Finch would love to have on the bench to be able to go to if they need a stop. And then the last player would be Jesse Edwards. Jesse Edwards is an undrafted rookie, played his last season of college at West Virginia, spent 4 years at Syracuse before that. And he is I thought he was maybe, I don't know if he was the worst player on the floor for the Wolves in the preseason game, but certainly didn't look the part of an NBA big. He is a very light version of what Rudy Gobert is. At least he's that archetype of player, right? He's nowhere near the rim protector he is, but he can block some shots. He's okay as a presence in the paint. He's got to rebound better than what he showed at he had a couple pretty good summer league games, but he's got to rebound the ball a little bit better. But the idea is he's a pick and roll big, right? Like he's a rim runner in transition. He doesn't have a whole lot of range on his shot at all. It's a very similar archetype to Rudy Gobert. So that's my take on what Jesse Edwards is. And he is, but like, I mean, you get past Rudy, Julius Randle, Nas, Luka Garza now is very clearly the next big up. There's nobody else. Like then you're into Leonard Miller territory. And I think, again, Leonard Miller is a very different archetype than Rudy Gobert. So Jesse Edwards, I think, would get the shot. Like, if Rudy ends up, say he tweaks something and he misses a few games or whatever, Jesse Edwards is going to be on that roster as like, hey, if Luka Garza gets into foul trouble, because Garza would play in the event that Rudy gets hurt. Like you're not just Garza, like, moves up the depth chart with this trade, I believe. I don't think he plays every given night he could play any given night. I don't think he plays every night, Garza. But if Rudy or Nas and remember, Randle still got a shoulder issue. Like, we'll see how healthy he is. Obviously, the Wolves approved the physical with the trade. So, like, he should be healthy-ish. But we don't know what that's going to look like, Um, and so depth-wise, Jesse Edwards could actually play a role, and they needed to add another big. And so, again, he's a good screener. He's athletic enough. He's very big. Some of his instinct shot blocking wise, I mentioned he's nowhere near the rim protectors Rudy Gobert, as hardly anybody is, of course. But as a 5-year college guy, you'd want there to be a little bit more polish there. Playing at big schools, Syracuse, West Virginia, you'd expect there to be a little more polish. So the Wolves will undoubtedly work on that. I think he'll spend a ton of time in the G League as well. I think Daishen Nix will spend a lot of time sitting on the Wolves bench, whereas Edwards and Clark will spend a lot of time playing for the Iowa Wolves, along with the other guys I mentioned earlier, Skylar Mays, Eugene Omoruyi. Like, all these guys are going to spend a ton of time with the Iowa Wolves down in Des Moines. So Edwards, I think, of the three, probably ends up playing the most at the NBA level. Now, it may only be a dozen games because the Wolves, as a contender, I talked at the top of the show about just how deep there are, how impressive the depth chart is, really 1 through 15, 1 through 16, as we said. They're not relying on their two-way guys like they may have several years ago. Remember the Tibbs regime and years following that, two-way guys played more. That's not necessary for a team that has aspirations to get to the finals and has a really deep roster with legit NBA players, which is a good thing, right? Like, that's the goal, is you shouldn't have to rely on two-way guys. Jesse Edwards, though, for me, would be the most likely to actually see playing time. All right. That's all we got for you today here on the show. I'll be back tomorrow, of course, on Wednesday. We're going to talk about the NBA GM survey came out. We'll talk through that. We'll also continue some player previews here as the week goes on. A big thank you for making Locked On Wolves your first listen every single day. Of course, this show is free and available everywhere. Wherever you like to listen to podcasts, you can find Locked On Wolves. You can also watch on YouTube or on the Locked On Sports Minnesota app on Roku and Amazon Fire TV. You can also follow the show on X at Locked On T-Wolves and also at Beecken with 2 B's, 2 E's, CKEN. Of course, the Locked On Wolves podcast is part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Remember, the Locked On Network is your local experts on all the biggest stories. Once again, I'm Ben Beecken. This is the Locked On Wolves podcast, and we'll catch you next time.